Miss Marple and the Poisoned Carol. Welcome back to Mindful Musings, where we explore the hidden depths of the human heart through stories that challenge and captivate. I'm your host, William, and today we're journeying to the snow-dusted village of St. Mary Mead on a Christmas Eve that begins with carols and ends with murder. Before we step into the frosty night alongside Miss Marple, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. Drop a comment and let me know your corner of the world. Now, let us begin. Chapter 1. The Christmas Eve Procession. The Christmas Eve of 1952 arrived in St. Mary Mead with a light dusting of snow that transformed the village into something from a Victorian greeting card. The church bells rang clear and bright through the crisp air as the St. Mary Mead choir assembled in the churchyard, their breath forming small clouds in the lamplight. Miss Jane Marple wrapped her warmest scarf more tightly around her neck and took her place among the altos, her hymnal clutched in gloved hands. The tradition of the Christmas carolling route was one of the oldest in St. Mary Mead, dating back nearly a century. Each year on Christmas Eve, the church choir processed through the village, stopping at 15 designated homes to sing carols and collect donations for the local orphanage. It was a beloved ritual that brought the community together in the spirit of the season, and Miss Marple had participated for more years than she cared to count. Marcus Hartwell, the choirmaster, stood at the front of the assembly. He was a man of perhaps 45, tall and distinguished with silver threading through his dark hair. He had led the choir for the past 6 years with considerable skill, transforming what had been a modest village ensemble into something approaching professional quality. His musical talent was undeniable, though Miss Marple had occasionally noted a certain coldness in his manner that seemed at odds with the warmth the season demanded. Tonight he looked particularly pleased with himself, resplendent in a new wool overcoat and expensive leather gloves. He raised his baton with a flourish as the church clock struck 6, and the choir launched into God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen with practiced precision. Their voices rose into the winter air as they began their procession down the lane, the first stop only minutes away. Dorothy Mills walked beside Miss Marple carrying a large thermos that gleamed silver in the lamplight. As choir treasurer and organizer of the carolling route, Dorothy had taken responsibility for ensuring everything ran smoothly. She was a capable woman of 50, widowed 3 years prior, who threw herself into church activities with tireless dedication. "I've brought extra mulled wine," Dorothy explained, patting the thermos, "just in case any of the households run short. We don't want anyone disappointed, especially Mr. Hartwell. He does so enjoy his refreshments along the route." Miss Marple noted the slight edge in Dorothy's voice when she mentioned the choirmaster, but before she could inquire further, they arrived at their first stop. The Hendersons' cottage glowed with welcoming light, and Mrs. Henderson stood at her door with a tray of steaming cups and a plate of shortbread biscuits dusted with sugar. The choir arranged itself in a semicircle and sang 3 carols, while the Hendersons and their guests listened from the doorway. When the final notes of Silent Night faded into the night, Mrs. Henderson stepped forward with her refreshments. Marcus Hartwell accepted a cup of mulled wine with a gracious smile, draining it quickly before leading the choir onward to the next house. This pattern repeated itself as they progressed through the village. At some homes, Hartwell accepted the offered refreshments eagerly. At others he politely declined, citing his intention to drive home later and his desire to limit his alcohol intake. Miss Marple observed that he seemed to follow no particular system in his choices, accepting wine at some houses while refusing identical offerings at others. By the time they reached the 8th stop, Thomas Reed's substantial Victorian home, the evening had taken on a magical quality. Snow had begun falling more heavily, and the carolers' voices seemed to carry further in the muffled quiet. Reed, a retired banker and longtime choir member, served mulled wine from an ornate silver service that had belonged to his grandfather. Hartwell accepted a generous portion, complimenting Reed on the excellent spicing. "Family recipe," Reed said with a tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Handed down through generations. I'm so pleased you approve, Mr. Hartwell." Miss Marple noticed the exchange of glances between Reed and Dorothy Mills, a moment of silent communication that seemed weighted with significance. But the choir was already moving on, voices lifting once more into the crystalline air. The evening progressed with clockwork precision. At each stop, the pattern repeated with comforting familiarity. Carols sung, donations collected, refreshments offered and sometimes accepted. Miss Marple found herself watching Marcus Hartwell more closely as the route continued, noting the flush that had begun to appear in his cheeks and the slight looseness that had crept into his conducting. 8 cups of mulled wine over the course of 3 hours was perhaps not excessive for a man of his size, but it was certainly more than prudent on a cold winter's night. By the time they approached the final stop, the vicar's house, the snow was falling in earnest. The choir was in excellent voice despite the cold, their spirits buoyed by the warmth of the hospitality they had received and the knowledge that hot tea and Christmas cake awaited them at journey's end. They arranged themselves one last time in the vicar's garden, launching into Hark the Herald Angels Sing with particular enthusiasm. Marcus Hartwell conducted with broad, sweeping gestures, his face animated with pleasure. Miss Marple sang her alto part automatically, her attention divided between the music and the subtle wrongness she sensed in the evening's proceedings. Something was amiss, though she could not yet identify what troubled her. As the final notes died away and the vicar stepped forward to welcome them inside, Marcus Hartwell lowered his baton and turned to face the choir with a satisfied smile. He opened his mouth to speak, and then his expression changed. The smile froze, then faltered. His hand went to his chest, and Miss Marple saw confusion and then fear flash across his features. "Mr. Hartwell?" Dorothy Mills stepped forward, her voice sharp with concern or perhaps something else. The choirmaster staggered, his baton falling from nerveless fingers to disappear into the snow. He tried to speak, but no words came. His knees buckled, and several choir members rushed forward to catch him as he collapsed. Within moments, he lay motionless in the snow, his eyes staring sightlessly at the falling flakes that settled on his face like a benediction. Chapter 2. Death by Degrees. Dr. Haydock arrived within minutes of being summoned, his medical bag in hand and his expression grim. The choir members had carried Marcus Hartwell's body into the vicar's study, laying him carefully on the leather sofa. Miss Marple stood near the doorway, observing the scene with the quiet attention that those who knew her had learned to respect. The doctor's examination was swift but thorough. When he straightened up, he looked troubled. "He's gone," he announced unnecessarily. "Been dead perhaps 5 minutes, no more." "Heart attack?" the vicar asked hopefully, as if a natural death might somehow be less disturbing than the alternative that hung unspoken in the air. Dr. Haydock frowned, studying the dead man's face with professional intensity. "Possibly, but there are certain signs that concern me. The particular colour of his lips, the way his pupils are dilated. I'll need to examine him more thoroughly, but my preliminary assessment is poisoning." A collective gasp went through the assembled choir members. Dorothy Mills had gone very pale, one hand pressed to her throat. Thomas Reed stood by the window, his face unreadable in the lamplight. Harold Price, the church warden, looked genuinely shocked, while Sarah Fletcher had begun to cry quietly into her handkerchief. "Poisoning?" the vicar repeated, as if the word itself was foreign. "But how? What kind of poison?" "I'll need to wait for the autopsy to be certain," Dr. Haydock replied. "But if I were to hazard a guess based on the symptoms, I'd say digoxin. It's a heart medication derived from foxglove. In therapeutic doses, it strengthens the heart's contractions. In larger doses, it's quite deadly." Miss Marple spoke for the first time, her voice gentle but clear. "Doctor, if it is digoxin, would the effect be immediate?" Dr. Haydock turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "That's an excellent question, Miss Marple. Digoxin poisoning can work in different ways depending on the dose. A massive single dose would kill within minutes to an hour, but a cumulative toxic dose built up over several hours could produce exactly what we've seen here. The victim appears relatively normal until suddenly the heart simply stops." "You're suggesting," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Mr. Hartwell might have been poisoned gradually throughout the evening." The implications of this statement settled over the room like the snow outside. Inspector Slack arrived shortly thereafter, summoned by the vicar's urgent telephone call. He was a broad, red-faced man who had investigated several cases in St. Mary Mead with varying degrees of success, often finding himself reluctantly dependent on Miss Marple's insights, a fact that never failed to irritate him. "Right then," he said, surveying the assembled choir with obvious displeasure, "I understand the deceased collapsed immediately after your carolling route concluded. That means he spent the entire evening in your company. I'll need statements from everyone about what Mr. Hartwell ate or drank at each stop." Dorothy Mills stepped forward, her voice remarkably steady. "I can help with that, Inspector. As organizer of the route, I kept careful track of our progress. We visited 15 houses tonight, and at 8 of them Mr. Hartwell accepted mulled wine. At the other 7 he declined refreshments, saying he needed to limit his alcohol intake because he was driving home." Inspector Slack made a note of this, so he drank wine at 8 different locations. Any one of those could have contained poison. "Not just any one," de Haydock interjected. "If my preliminary diagnosis is correct, and this is digoxin poisoning from a cumulative dose, then the poison must have been distributed across multiple servings. A single lethal dose in 1 cup would have killed him within the hour, not at the very end of the route." The inspector's expression grew darker. "Are you telling me that multiple people poisoned him? A conspiracy?" "Or," Miss Marple said quietly, "someone was very clever about how they administered the poison. Tell me, Mrs. Mills, you mentioned you brought extra mulled wine in that thermos. Did Mr. Hartwell drink from your supply?" Dorothy Mills nodded slowly. "Yes, at 3 of the stops. The Pritchards, the Weatherbys, and Mrs. Bantry's house. Their own supplies ran short, so I supplemented from my thermos." "So the poison could have been concentrated in your preparation," Inspector Slack said with evident satisfaction. "That would explain how it was distributed across multiple servings without requiring a conspiracy." But Dr. Haydock was shaking his head. "I'm afraid it's not that simple, Inspector. Based on the timing of death and the symptoms I observed, I estimate Mr. Hartwell consumed somewhere between 8 and 12 milligrams of digoxin tonight. That's roughly 4 to 6 times the maximum daily therapeutic dose, enough to be lethal when accumulated. If all that poison had been in Mrs. Mills's thermos and Mr. Hartwell drank 3 cups from it, each cup would have contained between 2.7 and 4 milligrams. "Is that significant?" the inspector asked impatiently. "Very," the doctor replied. "Digoxin has a distinctly bitter taste, especially in doses that high. Mulled wine is sweet and spiced, which would mask some bitterness, but not that much. Mr. Hartwell would certainly have noticed if anyone serving contained such a concentration. The fact that he continued drinking suggests the poison was more evenly distributed across all 8 servings, which means, Miss Marple finished quietly, that the poison was likely present in multiple preparations, not just one." Inspector Slack's face had gone from red to purple. "You're telling me I need to investigate 15 households for conspiracy to commit murder?" 8 households, Miss Marple corrected gently. "Only 8 served him mulled wine, 7 from their own preparations, and 3 that were supplemented by Mrs. Mills's thermos. The question is whether all 8 sources contained poison, or whether the poison was concentrated in fewer sources and carefully measured to achieve the cumulative effect we witnessed." The inspector glared at her, but before he could respond, Thomas Reed spoke up from his position by the window. "Inspector, I think you should know that there were irregularities in the choir's financial accounts. Several of us had begun to suspect that Mr. Hartwell was embezzling from the charitable fund." The room went very still. Sarah Fletcher stopped crying. Harold Price turned sharply toward Reed. Dorothy Mills's hand tightened on her thermos until her knuckles went white. "Embezzling," the inspector repeated. "And how many people knew about these suspicions?" Reed's expression was carefully neutral. 8 of us, Inspector. The senior members of the choir. We'd planned to review the accounts after Christmas and confront Mr. Hartwell with what we'd found." Inspector Slack looked around the room at the faces of the choir members, his expression a mixture of anger and resignation. "Let me see if I understand this correctly. 8 people had motive to want Mr. Hartwell dead. Those same 8 people all served him mulled wine tonight, and he died of what appears to be cumulative poison that would require multiple doses to be effective." "That does seem to be the situation," Miss Marple agreed, her knitting needles beginning to click as she withdrew her ever-present handiwork from her bag. "Though I suspect the truth is rather more complex than it appears at first glance. Murder usually is." The inspector began taking statements from each choir member, starting with those who had served Hartwell mulled wine. As Miss Marple listened to their accounts, she noted the small inconsistencies and careful phrasings that suggested rehearsed responses. These people were hiding something, and she was determined to discover what it was before Inspector Slack's heavy-handed investigation drove the truth deeper underground. Chapter 3. The Mathematics of Murder. The morning after Marcus Hartwell's death dawned grey and cold over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple rose early, her mind turning over the puzzle of the previous evening like her fingers working through a complicated knitting pattern. She dressed carefully against the chill and made her way to the village shop, where news and gossip flowed as reliably as the morning tea. Mrs. Bantry was already there, along with several other villagers, all discussing the shocking events of Christmas Eve. Miss Marple listened more than she spoke, gathering threads of information that might prove useful. "They say it was poison in the mulled wine," Mrs. Bantry was saying, her voice hushed with scandalized delight. "Can you imagine? Right under our noses, passed from house to house like a Christmas pudding." "8 houses served him wine," Mrs. Pritchard added. "The inspector's been round to all of them this morning, asking questions. My Harold is quite upset about it, says he's being treated like a criminal when all we did was offer hospitality." Miss Marple purchased her items and made her way home, her thoughts crystallizing around a central question. How exactly had the poison been distributed? The mathematical precision required for a cumulative dosing murder was considerable, suggesting either sophisticated planning or remarkable coordination among multiple parties. She had barely settled into her morning routine when Dr. Haydock appeared at her door, looking as though he'd had little sleep. "Miss Marple, I hoped I might find you at home. I've completed my preliminary examination of Mr. Hartwell, and there are some findings I thought you'd want to know about." Miss Marple ushered him into her sitting room and prepared tea while he arranged his thoughts. "The autopsy confirmed digoxin poisoning," he began. "But what's particularly interesting is the quantity involved. I estimate he consumed approximately 10 milligrams over the course of the evening." "That sounds quite precise, Doctor." "It is, which is what troubles me. You see, therapeutic doses of digoxin are measured in micrograms, thousandths of a milligram. The maximum daily dose for a patient would be around 0.25 milligrams. Mr. Hartwell consumed 40 times that amount, but spread over 8 servings in 3 hours." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "Which means each serving contained approximately 1.25 milligrams. "Exactly. And that's what's so suspicious. That's not a random amount. It's been carefully calculated to ensure that no single serving would be immediately lethal or even noticeably toxic, but the cumulative effect across 8 servings would be fatal." "Someone understood the pharmacology quite well," Dr. Haydock nodded grimly, "or multiple people coordinated very carefully. You see, Miss Marple, if this was a conspiracy involving all 8 households, each would need to know the exact amount to add to their mulled wine to ensure the cumulative total reached a lethal dose. That requires communication, planning, and access to the drug. And if it wasn't a conspiracy, then someone had to distribute the poison across multiple preparations without the other households knowing. That would require either contaminating multiple batches separately or finding a way to ensure Mr. Hartwell received poison at each stop, even from preparations that weren't originally tainted." Miss Marple considered this as she poured tea. Mrs. Mills had that large thermos. She supplemented the wine at 3 houses. Could she have added concentrated poison to those servings? "I've thought of that," the doctor replied, "but the mathematics don't work. If she'd put enough poison in 3 servings to achieve our total of 10 milligrams, each cup would have contained over 3 milligrams. At that concentration, even in spiced mulled wine, the bitterness would be noticeable. Mr. Hartwell would have commented or refused to drink it." So the poison was genuinely distributed across all 8 servings, each containing a sublethal but significant dose. "That's my conclusion, yes, which brings us back to conspiracy. 8 people, each adding approximately 1.25 milligrams to their mulled wine, probably ground from digoxin tablets and dissolved in the liquid." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, her fingers resuming their rhythmic work with the knitting needles. "Doctor, you mentioned that several people in the village take digoxin for heart conditions. Who are they?" Dr. Haydock shifted uncomfortably. "You know I can't discuss my patients' medical conditions, Miss Marple, even when one of them might be a murderer or multiple murderers working in concert." The doctor sighed. 6 people in St. Mary Mead currently have prescriptions for digoxin. Of those 6, 4 were among the 8 households that served Mr. Hartwell mulled wine last night. "And the other 2? "One is Mrs. Bantry, who didn't serve wine, only cookies. The other is confined to bed with pneumonia and certainly didn't participate in the carolling. But Miss Marple, having access to digoxin doesn't prove anything. The drug could have been stolen from medicine cabinets, borrowed from relatives, or even purchased. But it does narrow the field of likely conspirators to those who had easy access without arousing suspicion, Miss Marple observed. Tell me, Doctor, when did you last write prescriptions for these 4 patients? Within the past month for 3 of them. The 4th had theirs renewed about 6 weeks ago. Why? Because someone planning a murder would need to accumulate enough medication without their own supply running short and raising questions. If I were planning such a thing, I would start setting aside tablets well in advance. Dr. Haydock looked disturbed. You're suggesting this was premeditated, planned over weeks or months? Murder often is, particularly when it involves such precise calculation. This wasn't a crime of passion, Doctor. This was cold, careful, and collective. After the doctor left, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the village go about its subdued Christmas Day activities. The mathematics of the murder were elegant in a horrible way. 8 people, 8 servings, each contributing an equal portion of poison. It had the symmetry of ritual, the formality of justice collectively administered. But how had they coordinated it? How had 8 people agreed on such a plan, measured out precise doses, and executed it without a single one breaking ranks or making an error? That required not just planning, but absolute trust among the conspirators, a unity of purpose that went beyond simple agreement. She thought about Marcus Hartwell and what Thomas Reed had revealed about embezzlement. Theft from a charitable fund was a particularly despicable crime, one that violated the trust of the community and harmed those most vulnerable. The orphanage fund had been meant to provide Christmas gifts and winter necessities for children who had nothing. If Hartwell had indeed been stealing from that fund, the anger of those who'd discovered his theft would be considerable. But anger didn't usually lead to such cold-blooded precision. This suggested something more than rage. It suggested a deliberate decision, carefully considered and collectively endorsed. These 8 people had looked at their options and chosen murder, executed with the kind of planning usually reserved for church fetes or charity drives. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she worked through the implications. Somewhere in this village were 8 people who had decided that Christmas Eve, with its tradition of hospitality and goodwill, would be the perfect cover for murder. They had perverted the caroling route into a gauntlet of poisoned cups, transforming welcome into weapon. The question now was not just how they had done it, but why they had felt it necessary, and more importantly, whether they felt any remorse for turning celebration into execution. Chapter 4. The Special Rehearsal. Miss Marple spent much of Christmas Day in quiet contemplation, declining invitations to join various households for dinner. She needed time to think, to sort through the tangled threads of this case without the distraction of social obligation. By evening, she had formed a theory, but it required confirmation. The day after Christmas, she paid a visit to Dorothy Mills. The choir treasurer lived in a neat cottage on the edge of the village, surrounded by a well-tended garden that was now blanketed in snow. Dorothy answered the door looking tired, dark circles under her eyes suggesting sleepless nights. "Miss Marple, please come in. I've been expecting someone to call, though I thought it might be the inspector rather than you." They settled in Dorothy's sitting room, where a small fire burned in the grate. Miss Marple noticed immediately the calendar on the wall, its dates marked with careful notations in various coloured inks. Some were obvious: choir practice every Tuesday, caroling route planning, Christmas Eve circled in red. But there were other marks, small symbols that seemed to correspond to certain dates and certain names. "You were very organised about the caroling route this year," Miss Marple observed. "I noticed that some households who'd participated in previous years were excluded, the Johnsons, for instance, and the Blackwoods. Yet you included 3 households that had never been on the route before." Dorothy's hands tightened in her lap. "We needed to adjust the route for timing purposes. It's quite a long evening, and we wanted to ensure we finished before it got too late. And yet the route this year took exactly as long as last year's. I checked with the vicar. You left the church at 6 o'clock and arrived at the vicarage at 9:30, just as you did last Christmas. So it wasn't about timing at all, was it?" There was a long silence. Finally Dorothy spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "How much do you know, Miss Marple?" "I know that 8 senior choir members discovered Marcus Hartwell was embezzling from the charitable fund. I know that those same 8 members all served him mulled wine on Christmas Eve. I know that he died from a precisely calculated dose of poison distributed across those 8 servings. And I know that such precision requires coordination. Dorothy rose and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered garden. We had a special rehearsal 3 days before Christmas. Only senior members were invited. That's when I presented what I'd found in the accounts. You're the treasurer. You would have been the one to notice discrepancies. It started with small things, Dorothy continued, her voice gaining strength. Donation receipts that didn't quite match the deposited amounts. Expenses that seemed inflated. I began comparing our records to the bank statements, and that's when I saw the full extent of it. Marcus had been transferring money to a personal account for 5 years, nearly £30,000 in total. Miss Marple drew in a sharp breath. That's a considerable sum. Enough to prosecute him for fraud, certainly, but gathering sufficient evidence would take time, months, possibly, and there was a real risk he'd discover what we were investigating and destroy records or flee. He'd been planning a trip to the continent in January. Once he was gone, we might never recover the money or see him face justice. So the 8 of you decided to take matters into your own hands. Dorothy turned back to face Miss Marple, her expression defiant. We made a collective decision. Every one of us agreed. The orphanage fund was meant to help children who had nothing. Marcus was stealing from them, from the most vulnerable members of our community. He was using our trust, our goodwill, to line his own pockets while pretending to be a pillar of the church. And so you planned to murder him. We planned to deliver justice. There's a difference, Miss Marple. We knew he was guilty. We knew he'd stolen thousands of pounds from charity. We knew that even if he was prosecuted and convicted, he'd likely serve only a few years in prison and the money would never be fully recovered. Meanwhile, the orphanage would continue to suffer from his theft. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked steadily. Tell me about the planning. How did you coordinate it? Dorothy sat back down, some of the defiance leaving her posture. Thomas Reed knew about digoxin from his late wife's heart condition. He explained how it works, how a cumulative dose could be lethal while individual doses would appear harmless. We researched the pharmacology, calculated the amounts needed. And the procurement of the drug? 4 of us had prescriptions. Harold Price's mother takes it for atrial fibrillation. Sarah Fletcher's father has it for heart failure. Thomas still had tablets left from his wife's final prescription. And I take it myself for my own heart condition. We each set aside 2 tablets from our supplies over the course of 6 weeks, ground them to powder, measured precisely. Each person contributed an equal portion. Yes, that was important to us. No one would bear the full weight of responsibility. We were all equally guilty or equally justified, depending on how you see it. Each household would add their portion to the mulled wine they served. We practiced measuring and mixing to ensure the powder dissolved completely and the taste was masked by the spices. Miss Marple considered this carefully. But you needed to ensure Mr. Hartwell would drink at all 8 houses. How did you guarantee that? We arranged the route strategically. Houses known for particularly good mulled wine, places where Marcus would be reluctant to refuse hospitality without seeming rude, and we applied social pressure. When he tried to decline at Thomas's house, Thomas made such a point of the family recipe and his grandfather's silver service that Marcus felt obliged to accept. Very clever. And the 3 houses where you supplemented with your own thermos? Dorothy's expression became guarded. That was insurance. If any of the 8 households had their mulled wine run out before Marcus could drink from it, I would provide a cup from my thermos that contained the missing dose. That way, we could be certain he received all 8 portions. So, your thermos contained concentrated poison. 8 doses worth, yes. Enough to kill him several times over if he'd drunk it all. But he only had 3 cups from my supply, and they were served at houses that had genuine shortages. The other 5 houses served their own poisoned wine, Miss Marple's. Needles paused. That's quite a risk, Mrs. Mills. If Inspector Slack discovers that your thermos contained enough poison to kill Marcus Hartwell multiple times over, he'll arrest you for murder regardless of the conspiracy. I know, Dorothy said quietly. But someone had to take that risk. Someone had to ensure the plan succeeded. I was the organizer, the treasurer who'd discovered the theft. It seemed appropriate that I bear the greater burden. And the others? Do they know about the concentrated poison in your thermos? Dorothy shook her head. They think each dose came only from individual households. Only I know that my thermos contained backup doses. If the plan had failed, if Marcus had somehow refused all 8 servings, I would have found a way to get him to drink from my thermos directly. I was prepared to take sole responsibility if necessary. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her expression thoughtful. You care deeply about the orphanage fund. My daughter was in that orphanage, Dorothy said, her voice thick with emotion. Years ago, before I married. She died there of pneumonia when she was 6. The fund was supposed to provide warm clothing and medicine. If it had been properly managed, properly funded, she might have lived. When I discovered Marcus was stealing from that same fund, stealing from children just like my daughter, I knew I couldn't let it continue. So, this was personal for you in a way it wasn't for the others. Perhaps, but they all had their reasons. Harold's grandson is in the orphanage now. Sarah volunteers there every week. Thomas lost his wife partly because they couldn't afford the medical care she needed, while he was donating generously to the choir fund, not knowing Marcus was embezzling it. We all had stakes in seeing justice done. Miss Marple was quiet for a long moment, her needles clicking rhythmically. Mrs. Mills, do you feel any remorse for what you've done? Dorothy met her eyes steadily. I feel regret that it was necessary. But remorse? No. Marcus Hartwell was a thief who stole from children and orphans. He perverted trust and charity for his own gain. We gave him justice, Miss Marple. Perhaps not legal justice, but moral justice nonetheless. And if you're arrested, if all 8 of you face trial for murder, then we'll face it together, just as we committed the act together. We made our choice knowing the consequences. We're prepared to accept them. As Miss Marple walked home through the snow, she reflected on Dorothy Mills's words. The conspiracy was confirmed, the method explained, the motive clear. 8 people had looked at their situation and chosen murder over legal process, collective action over individual restraint. They had transformed a Christmas tradition into an execution, poisoned hospitality into weapon. But understanding the how and why didn't make the choice of what to do with that knowledge any easier. Miss Marple had solved the case, but the solution brought no satisfaction, only a profound sadness at what Christmas Eve had become in St. Mary Mead. Chapter 5. The Evidence in the Kitchen. Inspector Slack arrived at Miss Marple's cottage the next morning, looking harried and frustrated. She invited him in and prepared tea while he paced her small sitting room like a caged animal. I've questioned all 15 households on the carolling route, he said without preamble, and I've gotten nowhere. Everyone claims their mulled wine was perfectly innocent. No one saw anything suspicious. It's as if Hartwell poisoned himself through sheer force of will. Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands. Perhaps, Inspector, you're approaching this from the wrong direction. Instead of trying to identify one guilty party, consider what the evidence suggests about coordination among multiple parties. You think it was a conspiracy, Slack said, accepting his teacup with ill grace. Dr. Haydock suggested the same thing, based on the dosage mathematics, but proving conspiracy is nearly impossible without someone confessing or turning on the others. Not impossible, Miss Marple corrected gently, merely requiring different evidence. Have you examined the household's kitchens, Inspector? Specifically, have you looked for traces of ground medication, measuring implements, anything that might indicate preparation? Slack's eyes narrowed. You're suggesting I get search warrants for 8 different houses based on nothing more than speculation? I'm suggesting that if 8 people ground digoxin tablets and measured precise doses, they would have needed equipment to do so. Mortar and pestle, perhaps, or a coffee grinder. Small measuring spoons capable of handling milligram quantities, and they would have needed to practice to ensure the powder dissolved properly. The inspector set down his teacup with a decisive clink. Right then, I'll get my warrants. By that afternoon, Slack had secured permission to search the 8 households that had served Hartwell mulled wine. Miss Marple accompanied him, her presence tolerated rather than welcomed, but he'd learned from past cases that her observations often proved valuable. The first 5 searches yielded nothing conclusive. Normal kitchen equipment, no obvious traces of medication preparation, residents cooperative but unhelpful. But at Harold Price's home, things began to shift. In a kitchen drawer, tucked beneath tea towels, Inspector Slack found a small set of measuring spoons designed for baking. Nothing suspicious in itself, except that several of the smallest spoons showed traces of white powder in the tiny measurement markings. The inspector carefully collected samples, noting Price's increasing nervousness. "I use those for baking," Price said. "Flour, sugar, that sort of thing." "Of course," Slack replied pleasantly. "We'll have them tested just to be thorough." At Sarah Fletcher's cottage, they found a coffee grinder pushed to the back of a cupboard. It was clean, recently washed, but when Slack examined it closely under good light, he could see white residue in the tiny crevices around the blade mechanism. "I don't drink coffee," Sarah said when questioned. "That belonged to my father. I've been meaning to give it to charity." "Your father takes digoxin for his heart condition, doesn't he?" Miss Marple asked gently. Sarah's face went pale, but she said nothing more. At Thomas Reed's substantial Victorian home, the search initially seemed fruitless. Reed watched them with arms crossed and expressions stony as they went through his kitchen. But Miss Marple noticed something the inspector had missed: a calendar hanging inside the pantry door, marked with dates and times that corresponded to the choir's special rehearsal and subsequent meetings. "Mr. Reed," she said, pointing to the calendar, "these notations here, what do they refer to?" Reed glanced at the calendar and then away. Choir activities, rehearsals and such. "But we only rehearse on Tuesdays," Miss Marple observed. These meetings were on various days, always late evening, always at different locations. Reed's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. The most revealing search came at Dorothy Mills's cottage. Inspector Slack's team went through her kitchen with methodical precision, and what they found painted a damning picture. In her pantry, tucked behind jars of preserves, was a small wooden box containing an electronic jeweler's scale, the kind used for measuring tiny quantities with precision. "I use that for weighing postage," Dorothy said, but her voice lacked conviction. More significantly, they found her calendar with its coloured notations, and when Inspector Slack began photographing the entries, the pattern became clear. 8 different colours of ink, each corresponding to initials that matched the 8 households that had served Hartwell mulled wine. Meeting dates were marked with multiple colours indicating who would attend. In a drawer beneath the calendar, wrapped in tissue paper, was a small notebook. Dorothy tried to intercept Slack before he could examine it, but she was too late. The inspector opened it carefully, revealing pages of calculations, dosage requirements, dissolution rates, timing schedules. There were notes about digoxin's properties, copied from medical references. There were measurements of how much powder each standard tablet contained when ground. There were even practice notes about mixing the powder into mulled wine and testing whether the taste could be detected. "Mrs. Mills," Inspector Slack said quietly, his earlier frustration replaced by grim satisfaction, "I'm arresting you on suspicion of conspiracy to commit murder." Dorothy stood very still, her hands clasped before her. "I understand, Inspector, but you should know that I wasn't alone in this. There were 8 of us. We all participated equally." "Are you confessing?" "I'm stating facts. Whatever I did, 7 others did as well. If you're arresting me, you'll need to arrest them too." Inspector Slack looked at Miss Marple, who nodded slightly. "I believe Mrs. Mills is telling the truth, Inspector. This was a collective action from start to finish." By evening, all 8 conspirators had been arrested and brought to the village police station. They sat in various rooms, separated from one another, but united in their silence. Inspector Slack moved between them, trying to extract individual confessions, but each person gave the same response. They would only speak collectively or not at all. Finally, Inspector Slack brought them together in the largest room available, with Miss Marple present as an observer. The 8 sat in chairs arranged in a rough circle. Dorothy Mills, Thomas Reed, Harold Price, Sarah Fletcher and 4 others, Margaret Hendricks, Robert Foster, Elizabeth Carmichael and David Patterson. They looked at one another with expressions ranging from defiance to resignation, but there was no sense of betrayal among them, no finger-pointing or blame. "Right then," Inspector Slack said heavily, "I have evidence of conspiracy. I have the dosage calculations. I have the measuring implements with traces of medication. I have calendars showing your coordinated meetings. What I need now is a full accounting of what happened and who was responsible for what." Dorothy Mills spoke first. "We're all equally responsible, Inspector. That was the entire point. 8 people, 8 doses, shared guilt and shared purpose." "Mrs. Mills, your notebook suggests you were the primary organizer." "I coordinated, yes, but the decision was collective. At our special rehearsal 3 days before Christmas, I presented evidence that Marcus Hartwell had embezzled nearly £30,000 from the orphanage fund over 5 years. I showed them the bank statements, the falsified receipts, the pattern of theft. Thomas Reed took up the narrative. We discussed our options: report him to the police and risk a lengthy investigation that might fail to secure a conviction, confront him privately and risk him destroying evidence or fleeing, or take direct action. "You mean murder," Inspector Slack said bluntly. "We mean justice," Harold Price interjected. Marcus Hartwell was stealing from children, from the most vulnerable members of our community. The legal system would have given him a few years in prison at most, and the money would never be recovered. The orphanage would continue to suffer. Sarah Fletcher added quietly, "We voted, all 8 of us. Unanimous decision to proceed." Inspector Slack looked at each face in turn. "And none of you felt any hesitation? Any doubt about taking a man's life?" "Of course we felt doubt," Elizabeth Carmichael said. She was a schoolteacher, respected in the village for her dedication to her students. We spent hours discussing the morality of it, but in the end we concluded that allowing Marcus to continue was the greater evil. He would have kept stealing, kept harming children, kept betraying the trust of this community. So you decided to poison him on Christmas Eve, using the caroling tradition as cover. "The caroling route provided an opportunity," Dorothy said. "Multiple households, multiple servings of mulled wine, natural hospitality that wouldn't raise suspicion, and the timing meant he would die at the end of the evening, making it nearly impossible to trace the poison to a single source." Miss Marple spoke for the first time. "Tell me about the preparation. How did you ensure each dose was correct?" Dorothy looked at her steadily. "I did the initial calculations based on Marcus's weight and the pharmacology of digoxin. We needed approximately 10 milligrams total to ensure lethality when accumulated over 3 hours. Divided by 8 servings, that meant 1.25 milligrams per dose. You obtained the medication from prescriptions. 4 of us had legitimate access. We each contributed 2 tablets, ground them to powder using the coffee grinder at Sarah's cottage. I measured each portion using the jeweler's scale to ensure accuracy within 0.05 milligrams. We practiced dissolving the powder in hot mulled wine to confirm it wouldn't be detectable." Robert Foster, a retired chemist, added technical details. "Digoxin is reasonably soluble in alcohol and the heat helps dissolution. The spices in mulled wine, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, are sufficiently strong to mask the bitter taste if the concentration isn't too high. We tested multiple ratios before settling on our final preparation." "You tested it?" Inspector Slack looked horrified. "On what?" "On ourselves," Foster replied calmly. "Very small amounts, well below therapeutic levels, just to confirm the taste was masked. We weren't about to test it on animals or other people." Inspector Slack sat down heavily, overwhelmed by the methodical nature of the conspiracy. "And on Christmas Eve, you each added your portion to the mulled wine you served?" "Yes," Dorothy confirmed. "We'd arranged the route to include all 8 households. We made sure Marcus would feel obligated to accept our hospitality. The social pressure of refusing mulled wine at Christmas is considerable, especially when hosts make a point of their special recipes or family traditions." "And Mrs. Mill's thermos?" Dorothy hesitated for the first time. "My thermos contained backup doses. If any household's preparation failed or Marcus refused their wine, I would supplement from my supply. As it happened, I served him 3 times at houses where their own wine ran genuinely short. Your thermos contained enough poison to kill him multiple times over." "Yes. I was prepared to take sole responsibility if necessary. If the plan failed, I would have found a way to ensure he drank enough from my thermos alone." Inspector Slack looked at the assembled group with a mixture of anger and reluctant respect. "You understand that you'll all be charged with conspiracy to commit murder, that you'll face trial and likely imprisonment?" "We understand," Thomas Reed said. "We accepted that possibility from the beginning. We made our choice with full knowledge of the consequences." "And you feel no remorse, Lynette?" the inspector asked. The 8 conspirators looked at one another. It was David Patterson, the quietest of the group, who finally spoke. "We feel regret that it was necessary. We feel sorrow that the world is such that sometimes good people must do terrible things to stop greater evils. But remorse for stopping Marcus Hartwell from stealing from orphans? No, Inspector, we don't feel that." Miss Marple had been silent throughout most of the interrogation, her knitting needles clicking softly. Now she looked up, her blue eyes moving from face to face. "There's one thing I don't understand. Why Christmas Eve? Why not choose a less symbolically charged occasion?" Dorothy Mills met her gaze. "Because Christmas is about giving, Miss Marple. About generosity and community, and caring for those who have nothing. Marcus Hartwell perverted all of that. He took advantage of people's Christmas charity, their goodwill, their desire to help children in need. It seemed fitting that his crime should end during the season that most clearly revealed its evil." "So you perverted the Christmas tradition in turn," Miss Marple said quietly. "You transformed caroling, which should spread joy and peace, into a murder weapon. You turned hospitality into poison, welcome into weapon." "Yes," Dorothy acknowledged. "We did, and that burden will stay with us forever. But so would the burden of doing nothing, of letting Marcus continue to steal from children while we sang carols and pretended everything was fine." Inspector Slack stood. "Right then, I'll need formal statements from each of you separately. You'll be held pending charges. I suggest you each contact a solicitor." As the conspirators were led away to give their individual statements, Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting abandoned in her lap. Inspector Slack sat down beside her, suddenly looking very tired. "What do you think, Miss Marple? Was this justice or murder?" She was quiet for a long moment. "It was murder, Inspector. Premeditated, carefully planned, executed with precision. The law is quite clear on that." But, I understand why they did it. That doesn't excuse it, but it explains it. They saw a wrong that wouldn't be righted through legal channels, or at least not quickly enough to prevent further harm. They chose to take action themselves. Vigilante justice. Is there any other kind when people lose faith in institutions? Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. "That's what troubles me most about this case, Inspector. Not that 8 people committed murder, though that's certainly troubling enough, but that 8 decent, law-abiding citizens looked at their options and concluded that murder was preferable to trusting the legal system to deliver justice." Inspector Slack rubbed his face wearily. "The courts will have to sort this out. Conspiracy to commit murder carries serious penalties, but with 8 defendants and a victim who was demonstrably a thief, it's going to be complicated." "Juries are unpredictable when sympathies are engaged," Miss Marple observed. "These 8 people will have considerable support in the village. Many will view them as heroes rather than criminals." "Does that make it right?" "No," Miss Marple said firmly. "It makes it understandable but not right. Murder is murder, regardless of the victim's character or the murderer's motives. The moment we start excusing it, we lose something essential to civilization." She gathered her knitting and prepared to leave. "But, Inspector, there's one more thing you should verify. The embezzlement Marcus Hartwell allegedly committed. Make sure it's real and documented. If these 8 people murdered an innocent man based on false suspicions, that changes everything." Inspector Slack nodded slowly. "I'll review the financial records tomorrow, though somehow I suspect we'll find exactly what Dorothy Mills claimed." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "I suspect we will, which makes this case a tragedy rather than a simple crime. 8 good people driven to murder by another person's greed and betrayal. Everyone loses, Inspector. Everyone." Chapter 6. The Accountant's Tale. The morning brought fresh complications to the case. Inspector Slack had requested a financial auditor from London to examine the choir's accounts, and the man arrived early, armed with ledgers, bank statements, and a determination to uncover the truth about Marcus Hartwell's alleged embezzlement. His name was Mr. Geoffrey Pemberton, a precise man in his 50s who approached numbers with the devotion others reserve for religion. Miss Marple observed him through the window of the church hall, where he'd set up his temporary office, surrounded by papers and calculating machines, his expression growing progressively grimmer as the hours passed. By afternoon, Inspector Slack summoned Miss Marple to the hall. Mr. Pemberton looked up from his work, removing his spectacles to rub tired eyes. "Miss Marple," the inspector said, "Mr. Pemberton has completed his preliminary audit. I thought you should hear his findings." The auditor shuffled papers into order. "I've examined 5 years of financial records for the St. Mary Mead Church Choir Charitable Fund. The discrepancies Mrs. Mills identified are genuine and extensive. Mr. Hartwell employed several methods to embezzle funds, all quite clever in their execution." How much? Miss Marple asked quietly. £29,840 over 5 years, Pemberton replied with the precision of his profession. The methods varied. Sometimes he would issue receipt number 847 to a donor for £50, but record receipt 847 in the ledger as £20, pocketing the difference. Other times he inflated expenses, claiming the choir spent £300 on new music when they actually spent £150. He also created entirely fictitious expenses, maintenance fees for equipment that didn't exist, payment to suppliers who weren't real. Inspector Slack leaned against a table. So, the 8 conspirators were correct. Hartwell was definitely stealing. Without question, Pemberton confirmed. Moreover, he was quite systematic about it. He started small, perhaps £200 in the first year, testing whether anyone would notice. When no one did, the amounts increased. Last year alone, he took nearly £8,000. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. Could this have been prosecuted successfully? Almost certainly, given time to properly document everything. However, Pemberton paused, choosing his words carefully. Mr. Hartwell had been clever about one thing. He'd structured his theft so that proving it would require extensive audit work, tracing dozens of transactions across multiple years. A defense attorney could argue that the discrepancies were accounting errors rather than deliberate theft, particularly for the smaller amounts. How long would a proper investigation take? Inspector Slack asked. 3 to 4 months minimum. Possibly longer if Mr. Hartwell challenged the findings and demanded individual verification of every transaction. And during that time, he would have had opportunity to destroy evidence or claim records were lost or damaged. Miss Marple set down her knitting. So the 8 conspirators were correct in their assessment that legal prosecution was uncertain and time-consuming. I'm afraid so, Pemberton said. Justice delayed is often justice denied, particularly in financial crimes where evidence can be manipulated or destroyed. After the auditor left, Inspector Slack sat heavily in one of the church hall chairs. This makes everything more complicated, Miss Marple. The 8 are guilty of murder, clearly, but their victim was also guilty. Perhaps not legally convicted, but morally certain. How does one weigh that? One doesn't, Miss Marple replied. The law exists precisely to prevent individuals from making such calculations. Once we allow people to commit murder because they believe their victim deserved it, we've abandoned civilization for chaos. But surely you feel some sympathy for them. Sympathy, yes. Understanding, certainly. But approval? No, Inspector. They chose murder when other options existed, however imperfect those options might have been. That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Thomas Reed appeared at her door, no longer under arrest, but required to remain in the village pending formal charges. He looked haggard, older than his 60 years, the weight of the past days clearly upon him. Miss Marple, may I speak with you? Not about the case itself, I've said all I have to say to the inspector, but about something else, something that's been troubling me. She invited him in and prepared tea while he settled uneasily into her sitting room. When she'd poured for both of them, he began speaking, his voice heavy with emotion. My wife Eleanor died 3 years ago. Heart failure, the same condition for which she'd been taking digoxin. Toward the end, we couldn't afford the full course of treatment she needed. The specialists, the procedures, they were beyond our means. Meanwhile, I'd been donating generously to the choir fund every month, believing I was helping children in need. You felt betrayed when you learned the money was being stolen. More than betrayed. Miss Marple, if that money had been properly used, if even a fraction of what Marcus stole had been available to us, Eleanor might still be alive. I calculated it last night, unable to sleep. The treatment she needed would have cost approximately £12,000. Marcus stole nearly £30,000. He took my wife's life as surely as if he'd pushed her down the stairs. Miss Marple listened without interrupting as Reed continued, his words tumbling out with the force of long-suppressed grief. When Dorothy revealed the embezzlement at our special rehearsal, something broke inside me. I saw Eleanor's face, remembered watching her struggle for breath, recalled the doctor telling me there were treatments available but we couldn't afford them. And all the while, Marcus Hartwell was stealing from the charity I supported, living comfortably on money that should have helped people like my wife. So you voted for murder. I voted for justice, or at least that's what I told myself. But now, sitting in that police cell, I've had time to think, to really think about what we did. He set down his teacup with trembling hands. "We poisoned him, Miss Marple. We planned his death methodically, measured out the doses like a recipe, and we executed him during Christmas caroling. What have we become?" "That's a question you must answer for yourself, Mr. Reed." I keep thinking about the moment he collapsed. We'd just finished singing, and he turned to us with that satisfied smile, so pleased with himself, with the choir, with the evening. And then his face changed, confusion and fear replacing satisfaction. He knew in those final moments. He knew he'd been poisoned, though he couldn't have understood how or why. "Did you feel remorse then?" Reed was quiet for a long moment. "I felt relief. Is that terrible? I felt relief that it was done, that he would steal no more, harm no more, betray no more. The remorse came later, in the police station, when I had to face what we'd actually done. We didn't just kill Marcus Hartwell. We killed something in ourselves, some essential belief in law and justice and the right way to handle wrongs." Miss Marple's needles clicked gently. "Mr. Reed, why have you come to me with this?" "Because everyone else will see this as a simple moral calculation. Marcus was guilty. We punished him. Case closed. But you understand, don't you? You understand that we can be right about his guilt and still wrong about what we did. You understand the complexity." "I understand that human beings are capable of extraordinary rationalization when their emotions are engaged. You lost your wife and blamed Marcus Hartwell, perhaps rightly, but that didn't give you the right to execute him." "No," Reed agreed quietly, "it didn't. And now 8 of us will pay the price for that decision. Our families will suffer, our reputations will be destroyed, the church will be torn apart. And for what? Marcus is dead, but the money he stole won't be recovered. The orphanage won't benefit from our actions. We've simply added murder to theft, compounded the tragedy." "Have you shared these thoughts with the others?" "I tried yesterday, but they're still in the phase of righteous conviction. They believe we did what was necessary. Perhaps in time they'll come to see it differently, but right now they're united in their certainty that we were justified." Miss Marple poured more tea, her movements deliberate and calming. "Mr. Reed, I cannot absolve you of what you've done, but I can tell you that recognizing the moral weight of your actions is the first step toward genuine atonement. The question now is what you'll do with that recognition." "What can I do? I've confessed to conspiracy to commit murder. I'll go to trial, likely to prison." "You can tell the truth," Miss Marple said simply. "Not the facts, the inspector has those. But the truth about what this kind of collective action does to individuals, to communities, to the very fabric of society. You can help others understand that vigilante justice, however satisfying in the moment, ultimately destroys everyone it touches." Reed stood to leave, looking somewhat steadier than when he'd arrived. At the door, he paused. "Miss Marple, do you think we're evil people?" She considered the question carefully. "No, Mr. Reed. I think you're ordinary people who made an extraordinary, terrible decision when you let grief and anger override judgment and law. That doesn't make you evil. It makes you human, flawed and fallen like all of us. But it also makes you responsible for the consequences of your choice." After he left, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching darkness settle over St. Mary Mead. The village looked peaceful, snow-covered and serene, giving no indication of the turmoil roiling beneath its surface. 8 of its citizens awaited trial for murder. Families were divided over whether those 8 were heroes or criminals. The church was in crisis, its charitable work tainted by both Hartwell's theft and the conspirators' response. And through it all, Miss Marple reflected, the fundamental question remained unanswered. What does a community do when its trust is betrayed and its institutions seem inadequate to deliver justice? The 8 conspirators had chosen murder. Others might choose different responses. But the question itself would persist, a challenge to every generation that faced wrongs without easy remedies. Her knitting needles resumed their rhythm, forming patterns that emerged only with patience and careful attention to each individual stitch. Much like the pattern of human behavior, she thought, visible only to those willing to look closely and think clearly about what they observed. Chapter 7. The Vicar's Dilemma. The scandal surrounding Marcus Hartwell's murder had placed the vicar, the Reverend Timothy Ashford, in an impossible position. 8 of his most dedicated parishioners were charged with conspiracy to commit murder, while the victim had been stealing from the church's charitable fund. On Sunday morning, 3 days after Christmas, he stood in his pulpit and looked out at a congregation divided against itself. Miss Marple sat in her usual pew, observing the faces around her. Some looked sympathetic toward the 8 conspirators, others horrified, still others confused and uncertain. The vicar's sermon would be carefully scrutinized for any hint of his personal views, and everyone present knew it. "My dear friends," the vicar began, his voice heavy with emotion, "we gather today in the shadow of tragedy. Tragedy upon tragedy, betrayal layered upon betrayal. We are a community in crisis, and I would be remiss if I did not address what has happened directly and honestly." He paused, gathering his thoughts. Marcus Hartwell served as our choirmaster for 6 years. He brought musical excellence to our worship and appeared to be a dedicated servant of this church. We now know that appearances deceived us. Mr. Hartwell was stealing from the orphanage fund, taking money meant for the most vulnerable children in our community, and using it for his personal benefit. This betrayal cuts deeply, and I understand the anger many of you feel. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the congregation. However, the vicar continued, his voice firming, 8 members of our community responded to this betrayal by planning and executing Mr. Hartwell's murder. They poisoned him during our Christmas Eve caroling, transforming a sacred tradition into an instrument of death. This too is betrayal, perhaps an even deeper one, because it strikes at the heart of what we claim to believe as Christians. Now the murmurs turned uncertain, some nodding, others shaking their heads. I know many of you believe those 8 were justified in their actions. You see Marcus Hartwell as a villain who got what he deserved. You argue that the legal system would have been too slow, too uncertain, too lenient. You may even view the 8 as heroes, taking courageous action to stop a thief from continuing his crimes. The vicar's gaze swept the congregation, stopping briefly on the families of the accused conspirators, sitting together in a protective cluster. But I must tell you, as clearly and firmly as I can, that murder is never justified. Never. Not when the victim is guilty of theft. Not when legal justice seems uncertain. Not when we are angry and hurt and desperate for immediate action. The commandment is clear, "Thou shalt not kill." It contains no exceptions for victims we deem deserving of death. Uncomfortable shifting in the pews, but the vicar pressed on. What troubles me most about this tragedy is not just the murder itself, but what it reveals about us as a community. 8 good people, people I've known and respected, people who have served this church faithfully for years, looked at their situation and concluded that murder was the right response. How did we fail so completely that this seemed like justice rather than crime? Miss Marple found herself nodding slightly. The vicar had identified the core issue with admirable clarity. We live in a time when institutions are increasingly distrusted, courts are slow, police are overwhelmed, justice often seems elusive. It's tempting to take matters into our own hands, to become judges and executioners ourselves, but that path leads only to chaos. If we all acted as those 8 did, deciding which wrongs justify death and which don't, we would destroy civilization itself. He paused, his expression pained. I understand the impulse. Believe me, when I learned what Marcus had stolen from the orphanage fund, I felt rage. I wanted him punished immediately and severely. But wanting something and acting on that want are different things. We must be better than our worst impulses. We must trust that systems, however imperfect, are preferable to vigilante violence. The vicar's voice softened. I pray for the 8 who committed this murder. I pray they find peace and redemption, though they must also face earthly justice for what they've done. I pray for Marcus Hartwell's soul, despite his crimes. I pray for his family who grieve a loved one and must also grapple with his theft. And I pray for us, this community, that we might learn from this tragedy rather than letting it divide us permanently. After the service, the congregation dispersed in uneasy clusters, some approaching the vicar to express support, others leaving quickly to avoid uncomfortable conversations. Miss Marple lingered, waiting until the church had mostly emptied before approaching Reverend Ashford. "That was a brave sermon, Vicar," she said quietly. He smiled wearily. "Brave or foolish, I'm not sure which. I've likely alienated half the congregation regardless of which position they held coming in." "Truth often alienates," Miss Marple observed, "but it's still necessary." They walked together through the churchyard, the vicar's breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "Miss Marple, may I ask your opinion on something? I've been struggling with whether to visit the 8 in custody. As their vicar, I feel obligated to offer spiritual counsel, but I don't want to seem to condone what they've done." "You can minister to them without approving their actions," Miss Marple said. "In fact, they probably need spiritual guidance now more than ever, precisely because they're struggling with the weight of what they've done. Mr. Reed came to see me yesterday. He's beginning to experience genuine remorse, but he needs help processing those feelings." "Thomas came to you?" The vicar looked surprised. He needed to talk to someone outside the conspiracy, someone who wouldn't simply affirm that they were justified. "I suspect others may have similar needs as the reality of their situation settles in." The vicar nodded slowly. "I'll visit them tomorrow, though I'm not sure what to say. How does one counsel 8 people who committed premeditated murder for what they sincerely believed were good reasons?" "You remind them that good intentions don't sanctify evil actions," Miss Marple said. "You help them understand that remorse is not weakness, but the first step toward genuine repentance. And you make clear that facing earthly consequences doesn't preclude the possibility of spiritual redemption." They had reached the vicarage gate. The vicar paused, his hand on the latch. "Do you think they'll be convicted, Miss Marple? A jury hearing about Hartwell's embezzlement might be sympathetic." "They've confessed to conspiracy and premeditation," Miss Marple replied. "That makes conviction likely. The question is sentencing, and there I think you're right that the circumstances might lead to some leniency, but they'll face serious prison time regardless." "And the families left behind, the children and spouses who had no part in this?" "They'll suffer," Miss Marple said bluntly. "That's one of the many tragedies here. The conspirators thought they were acting alone, taking personal responsibility, but their actions will harm their families for years to come. Children will grow up with parents in prison. Spouses will face financial hardship and social stigma. The ripples spread far beyond the 8 who made the decision." The vicar looked troubled. "How do we help those families? How do we maintain community when some view the 8 as criminals and others as heroes?" "Carefully," Miss Marple said. "With compassion for all involved, including those who disagree with us. This village will be divided for quite some time, Vicar. Your role is to be a bridge, refusing to let either side claim exclusive moral authority while insisting that we remain in community despite our differences." "That's a tall order," the vicar said with a weak smile. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but then shepherding a flock through crisis always is." That afternoon, Miss Marple received another visitor, this time Sarah Fletcher's elderly father, who had come with his daughter's knowledge to speak about his role, however inadvertent, in providing the digoxin used for murder. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice quavering with distress, "Sarah used my medication to poison a man. I provided the means for murder." "You provided medication for your heart condition," Miss Marple corrected, gently. "Your daughter chose to misuse it. That's not your fault. But if I'd kept better track of my pills, if I'd noticed some going missing, perhaps I could have prevented this." Miss Marple invited him to sit and prepared tea, giving him time to compose himself. "Mr. Fletcher, one of the insidious things about this conspiracy is how it distributed guilt across many people. 8 people each contributed a portion of the poison. 4 people with prescriptions each provided tablets. Everyone involved can claim they only played a small part, that no individual action was sufficient to cause death. But collectively they killed him. Exactly. And that diffusion of responsibility made it psychologically easier for each person to participate. No one had to face the full weight of murder alone, but it also means that many people, including innocent ones like yourself, are now entangled in the aftermath." Mr. Fletcher sipped his tea with shaking hands. "Sarah came to see me yesterday. She told me everything. She said she knew taking my pills was wrong, but she felt it was necessary to stop Hartwell. She showed no remorse, Miss Marple, my own daughter, and she showed no remorse for murder. Do you think that will change? I hope so. I pray so. But right now, she's convinced she did the right thing. They all are, except apparently Thomas Reed, who you say is beginning to have doubts." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "The human capacity for self-justification is remarkable, Mr. Fletcher. Your daughter and the others have constructed a narrative in which they're heroes, stopping a villain through necessary action. Maintaining that narrative protects them from the full horror of what they've done. But, eventually, for most people, reality breaks through. The weight of taking a human life, no matter how deserving they believe the victim was, becomes unbearable. And if it doesn't, if they continue to believe they were right, then they'll serve their prison sentences convinced they're martyrs rather than murderers. That's perhaps the saddest outcome of all, because it means they've learned nothing and would likely do the same thing again under similar circumstances. Mr. Fletcher was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said, "What should I do, Miss Marple? How do I support my daughter while not condoning what she's done? You love her unconditionally while making clear your disapproval of her actions. You visit her in custody and eventually in prison. You maintain your relationship while refusing to pretend that murder is ever justified. It's a difficult balance, but it's the only honest path forward." After he left, Miss Marple reflected on the expanding circle of harm caused by the 8 conspirators' decision. Marcus Hartwell was dead. 8 people faced murder charges. Their families were devastated. The church was divided. The orphanage fund was tainted. The Christmas caroling tradition was forever darkened, and elderly parents like Mr. Fletcher were left wondering how their children had become capable of cold-blooded murder. The cost of vigilante justice, she thought, always exceeded the calculations of those who pursued it. They saw only the immediate satisfaction of punishing a guilty party. They failed to account for the cascading consequences that would ripple through community and family for years to come. Her knitting needles continued their steady rhythm, forming a pattern that emerged only through patience and careful attention to each individual stitch. If only human relationships could be so carefully managed, she thought. If only wrong choices could be unpicked and redone like dropped stitches. But life allowed no such corrections. Once murder was committed, the pattern was permanently marred, the fabric of community forever weakened. Chapter 8. The Trial Approaches. As January progressed toward February, St. Mary Mead settled into an uneasy routine. The 8 conspirators remained in custody awaiting trial. Their families struggled with the dual burden of social stigma and financial hardship. The church attempted to function normally while dealing with the aftermath of betrayal and murder. And Miss Marple continued her quiet observations, noting how the community fractured along lines of sympathy and condemnation. The trial date was set for early March, and as it approached, the village became increasingly tense. Reporters from London newspapers had begun appearing, interviewing villagers and writing sensational accounts of the Christmas Carol murder and the Vigilante 8. Public opinion beyond St. Mary Mead seemed divided, with some viewing the conspirators sympathetically, while others condemned them absolutely. Miss Marple received a visit from the solicitor representing the 8 defendants, a sharp-minded woman named Caroline Westbrook, who had taken the case despite its obvious difficulties. She wanted to understand the village dynamics and thought Miss Marple might provide useful context. "The prosecution's case is strong," Miss Westbrook said frankly as they sat in Miss Marple's parlour. 8 people conspired to commit murder. They've confessed to planning, preparing and executing the crime. The evidence is overwhelming. My job is to convince a jury that they deserve mercy despite their guilt." "And how do you plan to do that?" Miss Marple asked. "By humanizing them, by showing that they're not criminals by nature but ordinary people pushed to extraordinary action by circumstances, by highlighting Marcus Hartwell's crimes and the failures of institutional justice that made them feel murder was their only option." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Are you certain that's wise, Miss Westbrook? Justifying their actions may actually harm your case." "What do you mean?" "If you present them as having made a rational choice, as having weighed their options and deliberately selected murder, you reinforce the prosecution's argument that this was cold, blooded, premeditated killing. But if you present them as good people who made a terrible mistake in a moment of collective passion, you might elicit more sympathy." Miss Westbrook considered this. But they didn't act in passion. They planned methodically over weeks. That's the central problem. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "which is why I'm not optimistic about their chances. A jury might understand a crime of passion, even sympathize with it. But this level of calculation and coordination suggests people who are capable of extreme actions when they decide the end justifies the means. That's rather frightening, even if one sympathizes with their motives." "You think they'll be convicted?" I think conviction is virtually certain. The question is sentencing, and there you may have more room to work. If you can demonstrate genuine remorse, show that they understand the gravity of what they've done and wouldn't repeat it, a judge might show leniency. Miss Westbrook made notes on a small pad. The problem is that most of them don't show remorse. They remain convinced they did the right thing. Only Thomas Reed has expressed any doubt, and even he is conflicted. Then perhaps your strategy should be to separate Mr. Reed from the others. Present him as someone who recognized the moral horror of what they'd done and can serve as an example of redemption. The others may have to face harsher consequences. That would destroy the unity they've maintained. They've been adamant that they all share equal responsibility. Miss Marple looked at the solicitor steadily. They do share equal responsibility for the crime, but they don't share equal capacity for understanding what they've done. Some will eventually experience genuine remorse. Others may never see beyond their self-justification. Treating them as identical when they're not doesn't serve justice or truth. After Miss Westbrook left, Miss Marple reflected on the approaching trial. The 8 conspirators had created their own tragedy through a series of choices, each seemingly reasonable in isolation but catastrophic in combination. Discovering Hartwell's theft, meeting to discuss it, voting to take action, planning the method, obtaining the poison, executing the plan. Each step had moved them further from the community of law-abiding citizens they'd once been. That evening she received an unexpected telephone call from Dorothy Mills, who had been granted temporary release on bail due to her age and health. Her voice was strained but determined. "Miss Marple, I need to speak with you. May I call round tomorrow morning?" When Dorothy arrived the next day, she looked years older than she had before Christmas. Her face was drawn, her hands trembled slightly, and there was a hollowness in her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and troubled conscience. "I've been thinking," she began without preamble, "about what we did, about what it means, and I've reached some conclusions." Miss Marple poured tea and waited. "Thomas Reed has been saying we were wrong, that murder is never justified, regardless of the victim's crimes. I've been arguing with him, insisting that we did what was necessary. But last night, I couldn't sleep, and I found myself thinking about the moment Marcus collapsed. The look on his face, the confusion and fear, and I realized something." She paused, her teacup rattling slightly against its saucer. "I realized that I'd become exactly what I claimed to hate. Marcus stole from children, betrayed trust, used people's goodness for his own benefit. And what did I do in response? I betrayed trust. I used the caroling tradition, people's Christmas hospitality, their goodwill as a weapon. I became a thief myself, stealing life instead of money." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "That's a significant realization, Mrs. Mills. I thought I was different because my cause was just. But causes don't sanctify methods, do they? The orphans won't benefit from Marcus's death. The stolen money won't be recovered. All I've accomplished is to add murder to theft, to make the tragedy worse instead of better. Have you shared these thoughts with the others?" Dorothy shook her head. "They're not ready to hear it. They're still in the phase of righteous conviction. But I need to tell someone, and I thought you'd understand." "I do understand," Miss Marple said gently. "The question is what you'll do with this understanding." "I'm going to plead guilty at trial," Dorothy said, "not just to the facts which we've already confessed, but to the moral guilt. I'm going to tell the judge that what we did was wrong, inexcusable regardless of Marcus's crimes. I'm going to ask for the full penalty of the law. That won't be easy. The others may see it as betrayal. Let them. They deserve to make their own choices about how to proceed. But I need to face what I've done honestly. My daughter died in that orphanage, Miss Marple. She died because the fund didn't provide adequate resources. I've spent years being angry about that, blaming others for her death. And then when I had the chance to make things right, to ensure future children would be protected, I chose murder instead of reform. I chose revenge over redemption." Her voice broke slightly. "What kind of memorial is that to my daughter? What kind of mother kills in her child's name?" Miss Marple set down her knitting and spoke with unusual directness. "Mrs. Mills, you're showing remarkable courage in facing these truths. but you should know that your guilty plea and full acceptance of responsibility may result in a longer sentence than if you'd maintained the justification defense. I know, but I'd rather spend more years in prison as someone who understands what she did than fewer years as someone who remains convinced she was right. There's a difference between punishment and penance, Miss Marple. I'm ready for both. After Dorothy left, Miss Marple sat quietly, considering the transformation she'd just witnessed. Dorothy Mills had moved from righteous certainty to genuine remorse, from justification to repentance. It was the kind of moral evolution that gave hope in even the darkest situations. But she was only one of 8. The others remained convinced of their righteousness, willing to face prison rather than admit error. And that difference, Miss Marple reflected, would likely determine not just their sentences, but their capacity to rebuild their lives afterward. The week before the trial, Miss Marple attended a special church meeting called by the vicar to address the community's ongoing divisions. The church hall was packed, tensions running high, voices raised as people argued about the 8 conspirators and what their actions meant for St. Mary Mead. "They're heroes," insisted one faction. "They stopped a thief when the law wouldn't." "They're murderers," countered another. "They perverted Christmas and betrayed everything we claim to believe." The vicar tried to maintain order, but the meeting threatened to devolve into chaos. Finally, Miss Marple stood, her small figure somehow commanding attention. "If I may," she said quietly, and the room gradually fell silent. "We're arguing about whether 8 people are heroes or villains, as if they must be one or the other. But life is rarely so simple. They're people who did something terrible for what they believed were good reasons. They're people who chose murder when other options existed, however imperfect those options might have been. They're people who will face justice under the law, and whose families will suffer for their choices." She paused, her gaze moving around the room. "The question before us isn't whether to approve or condemn them. That's for courts and juries to decide. The question is how we, as a community, will move forward. Will we let this tragedy divide us permanently? Will we ostracize the families of the 8, punishing innocent children and spouses for crimes they didn't commit? Will we allow anger and disagreement to destroy the bonds that hold us together?" "But Miss Marple," someone called out, "how can we just forgive murder?" "I'm not asking you to forgive murder," she replied. "I'm asking you to remember that justice and vengeance are different things. The 8 will be tried and sentenced. They'll face consequences for what they've done. But their families, their children, their aging parents, they're innocent. They deserve our compassion and support, not our condemnation." Another voice: "What about the caroling tradition? Can we ever sing carols again without thinking of poison?" "Traditions can be darkened but not destroyed," Miss Marple said, "unless we allow them to be. Next Christmas, when we gather to sing carols, we can choose to remember only the tragedy, or we can choose to reclaim the tradition as something beautiful that was temporarily perverted. That choice is ours to make." The meeting continued for another hour, but the temperature had lowered, the discussion becoming more thoughtful and less accusatory. As people filed out, several approached Miss Marple to thank her for her words. But she took no satisfaction from it. Words were easy. Living with the consequences of the 8's actions would be much harder. As the trial date approached, Miss Marple found herself thinking often about Marcus Hartwell. In death, he'd been transformed from villain to victim, his crimes overshadowed by the crime committed against him. Yet his embezzlement remained fact, his betrayal of trust undeniable. He was both victim and villain, just as his killers were both sympathetic and guilty. The complexity troubled her, as it should. Easy answers were for people who didn't look closely enough at human nature. Those who did look closely found only shades of grey, moral ambiguity, good people capable of terrible things and terrible people capable of good things. The world was messy and complicated, and pretending otherwise solved nothing. On the eve of the trial, Miss Marple completed a particularly complex knitting pattern, a shawl with intricate lacework that had taken her months to complete. As she bound off the final stitches, she reflected that solving moral problems was nothing like completing knitting patterns. Knitting had clear instructions, definite outcomes, mistakes that could be corrected. Morality offered no such certainties, only difficult choices and consequences that rippled outward in unpredictable ways. The 8 conspirators had made their choice. Now they would face its consequences, and St. Mary Mead would be forever changed by what had happened on that Christmas Eve, when hospitality became weapon and carols became cover for murder. Chapter 9. The Verdict's Weight. The trial of the 8 conspirators began on a cold March morning at the Old Bailey in London. Miss Marple attended, sitting in the public gallery alongside villagers from St. Mary Mead, family members of both the accused and the victim, and curious members of the press. The courtroom hummed with tension as the defendants were led in, sitting together in the dock with expressions ranging from defiance to resignation. The prosecution presented its case efficiently and devastatingly. The evidence was overwhelming. The planning notebooks, the dosage calculations, the measuring equipment, the coordinated meetings, and most damning of all, the defendant's own confessions. The prosecutor painted a picture of cold-blooded conspiracy, 8 people who had systematically planned and executed a murder with chilling precision. This was not a crime of passion, the prosecutor declared. This was calculated, coordinated murder. The defendants met repeatedly to plan their crime. They researched poison and its effects. They practiced measuring doses. They arranged their caroling route to ensure the victim would consume poison at 8 different locations. They transformed a cherished Christmas tradition into a gauntlet of death, one poisoned cup at a time. The defense, led by Caroline Westbrook, faced an uphill battle. She didn't dispute the facts, but sought to contextualize them, to make the jury understand why 8 otherwise law-abiding citizens had chosen such drastic action. Marcus Hartwell stole nearly £30,000 from a charitable fund meant for orphans, she argued. He betrayed the trust of his community for 5 years, taking money that should have helped the most vulnerable children and using it for his personal enrichment. When my clients discovered this theft, they faced an agonizing choice: report him and risk a lengthy investigation that might fail, or take direct action to stop him. But Miss Marple could see from the jury's faces that this argument wasn't resonating as the defense had hoped. The jurors looked troubled rather than sympathetic, disturbed by the level of planning and coordination the conspiracy had required. The trial's pivotal moment came when Dorothy Mills took the stand. Unlike the other defendants who maintained they'd been justified, Dorothy spoke with stark honesty about what they'd done and what it meant. "I organized the murder," she said, her voice steady but filled with pain. "I coordinated the meetings, did the calculations, ensured everyone knew their role. I told myself I was seeking justice for my daughter who died in the orphanage, for the children Marcus had stolen from. But that was a lie I told myself to justify murder." The courtroom went absolutely silent. "The truth is simpler and more terrible. I wanted revenge. I wanted Marcus Hartwell to die, and I convinced 7 other good people to help me kill him. We didn't trust the legal system to deliver the justice we wanted as quickly as we wanted it, so we became judges, jury, and executioners ourselves." Caroline Westbrook looked stricken, clearly not expecting this testimony from her own client. The prosecutor looked satisfied. "We poisoned him during Christmas caroling," Dorothy continued. "We transformed hospitality into weapon, goodwill into murder. We each added 1/8 of a lethal dose to our mulled wine, spreading the guilt among us so no one had to face the full weight alone. But splitting guilt doesn't reduce it. 8/8 still equals 1 whole murder." "Mrs. Mills," the judge interjected, "you understand that this testimony is damaging to your defense?" "Yes, Your Honor, but it's the truth, and after months of lying to myself about what we did, I need to tell the truth. We were wrong. Murder is never justified, regardless of the victim's crimes. We should have trusted the legal system, however imperfect it might be. Instead, we took the law into our own hands and committed a crime worse than the one we sought to punish." The impact of Dorothy's testimony reverberated through the remaining days of trial. The other 7 defendants maintained their justification defense, arguing they'd had no choice, that Marcus deserved what happened, that they'd acted righteously. But Dorothy's stark admission of guilt and moral clarity created a sharp contrast. Thomas Reed, when he testified, showed signs of internal struggle. "I agreed to participate because I blamed Marcus Hartwell for my wife's death," he said. "If the money he stole had been available, Eleanor might have received the treatment she needed. But Dorothy is right. Killing Marcus didn't bring Eleanor back. It didn't recover the stolen money. It didn't help the orphans. It just added murder to theft, made the tragedy worse instead of better. The closing arguments came after 2 weeks of testimony. The prosecutor emphasized the premeditation and coordination, the cold calculation with which the 8 had planned their crime. The defense argued for understanding and mercy, pointing to Hartwell's crimes as mitigating factors. But it was Dorothy Mills's testimony that seemed to hang over the proceedings, a ghost of moral clarity that complicated everyone's comfortable positions. She had refused to let anyone, including herself, hide behind justifications and rationalizations. She had named murder for what it was, regardless of the victim's character. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, their verdict was swift and unanimous, guilty on all counts for all 8 defendants. The conviction surprised no one. The real question was sentencing. Before imposing sentence, the judge addressed the defendants directly. "You have been convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, one of the most serious crimes in our legal system. You planned and executed the killing of Marcus Hartwell with premeditation and coordination. No matter what crimes he may have committed, he deserved to face justice through proper legal channels, not execution by vigilante action." The judge paused, his expression grave. However, I must also acknowledge the unusual circumstances of this case. Mr. Hartwell was indeed guilty of substantial embezzlement from a charitable fund. His crimes were real and serious, even if they did not justify his murder. Moreover, you are not career criminals, but otherwise law-abiding citizens who made a catastrophic error in judgment. He looked at each defendant in turn. "I have considered your cases individually as well as collectively. Mrs. Dorothy Mills, you have shown remarkable moral courage in facing the full weight of your actions without hiding behind justifications. Your testimony demonstrated genuine remorse and understanding of what you did. For this reason, while I cannot excuse your crime, I can show some mercy in sentencing. You are sentenced to 12 years in prison." Dorothy nodded, accepting the sentence without reaction. "Mr. Thomas Reed, you have also demonstrated growing understanding of the moral horror of your actions. You are sentenced to 14 years in prison." The judge continued through the remaining 6 defendants, each receiving sentences between 15 and 18 years, with the longest sentences going to those who showed no remorse and continued to insist they'd been justified. As the defendants were led away, Miss Marple watched the families in the gallery. Children crying for parents they wouldn't see outside prison for over a decade. Elderly parents devastated by their children's crimes and punishment. Spouses facing years alone, struggling to maintain households and raise families without partners. The ripples of that Christmas Eve decision continued spreading outward, touching more lives with each passing day. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, seeking comments from anyone connected to the case. Miss Marple declined to speak, but she overheard fragments of interviews as she made her way through the crowd. "They were heroes," one villager insisted to a reporter. "They stopped a thief." "They were murderers," another countered. "They perverted Christmas itself." Both were right, Miss Marple reflected. Both were wrong. The truth was more complex than either simple narrative allowed. On the train back to St. Mary Mead, she sat quietly, watching the countryside roll past. The trial was over, the sentences delivered, but the consequences would continue for years. 8 people would spend the prime years of their lives in prison. Their families would struggle with stigma and hardship. The church would work to heal its divisions. The orphanage fund would need to be rebuilt and restored to proper management. And next Christmas, when the caroling tradition resumed, if it resumed, the ghost of Marcus Hartwell would walk alongside the choir, a reminder of what happens when people lose faith in justice and take vengeance into their own hands. Miss Marple arrived home as evening fell over St. Mary Mead. The village looked peaceful in the twilight, giving no sign of the turmoil it had endured. But she knew that beneath the serene surface, wounds were still raw, divisions still deep. She settled into her favourite chair and picked up her knitting, the rhythmic click of needles providing comfort and focus. The pattern she was working on was complex, requiring careful attention to avoid mistakes. Much like the work of rebuilding community, she thought, one stitch at a time, one careful choice after another, slowly creating something whole from individual threads. The trial was over, but the real work was just beginning. Chapter 10. Reflections on a Poisoned Carol. Spring came slowly to St. Mary Mead that year, as if even nature hesitated to offer renewal after so dark a winter. Miss Marple tended her garden with the same care she always had, but her thoughts often drifted to the 8 people now imprisoned for murder and the community left to grapple with their absence. The vicar had established a support group for the families of the convicted, providing both practical assistance and emotional support. Miss Marple helped where she could, organising meal deliveries and coordinating visits to the various prisons where the 8 were serving their sentences. It was quiet, unglamorous work, but necessary. One afternoon in late April, she received a letter from Dorothy Mills. It was written on prison stationery, the handwriting careful and controlled. "Dear Miss Marple," it began, "I wanted to write and thank you for your honesty throughout this terrible business. You never pretended that what we did was anything other than murder, even when it might have been easier to offer comfortable justifications. That honesty helped me face the truth about my own actions." The letter continued. "Prison is difficult, but I'm discovering that punishment can also be clarifying. When you're stripped of freedom and comfort, when you have nothing but time to think, you confront yourself in ways that ordinary life doesn't require. I'm learning things about myself I'd rather not know but need to understand." Dorothy wrote about the other conspirators. Thomas Reed was in the same facility, and they'd been able to talk. He too was experiencing genuine remorse, though it came in waves, alternating with periods where he still felt they'd been justified. The others, scattered across different prisons, apparently remained convinced of their righteousness, at least according to the letters Dorothy had received. "I think about Marcus Hartwell often," Dorothy wrote. "Not the thief we convinced ourselves he was, just a monster we had to eliminate, but the actual human being. He was talented, charming when he wanted to be, funny sometimes in choir rehearsals. He was also a thief and a betrayer of trust. Both things were true, and neither justified his murder. I took a complete human life, with all its complexity and potential, and reduced it to a simple calculation. Guilty, therefore deserving death. That reduction was my greatest sin." Miss Marple set down the letter and picked up her knitting. Dorothy Mills was doing the difficult work of genuine repentance, facing what she'd done without the comfort of justification. It wouldn't make her prison sentence easier, but it might make her life afterward possible. Not all the letters Miss Marple received were so reflective. Harold Price wrote insisting he regretted nothing, that Marcus Hartwell had gotten what he deserved. Sarah Fletcher's letters were defensive, claiming the legal system had treated them unfairly. They remained trapped in the narrative they'd created to justify murder, unable or unwilling to see beyond it. In June, Miss Marple attended a church meeting to discuss the future of the caroling tradition. The debate was contentious, with strong feelings on all sides. "We should cancel it permanently," some argued. "It's been poisoned, literally and figuratively. We can never sing carols again without thinking of murder." "We should reclaim it," others countered. "If we let what happened destroy this tradition, we give the tragedy permanent victory. We need to show that beauty and community can survive even terrible things." The vicar, looking tired, tried to find middle ground. "Perhaps we might modify the tradition, change the route, alter the format, create something new that honours the past while acknowledging what happened." Miss Marple listened to the debate without contributing. She understood both positions. Traditions could be darkened beyond redemption, but they could also be reclaimed through conscious effort and collective will. The choice wasn't obvious, and reasonable people could disagree. In the end, the church voted to continue the caroling tradition, but with significant changes. The route would be different, visiting different homes. Instead of accepting refreshments at each stop, the choir would gather at the church hall afterward for a communal meal, eliminating the house-to-house refreshments that had been the vehicle for poison. And there would be a moment of silence at the beginning, acknowledging what had happened and affirming the community's commitment to justice through law rather than vigilante action. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. An attempt to move forward without forgetting, to rebuild without pretending the destruction hadn't occurred. That summer, Miss Marple made a trip to London to visit Dorothy Mills in prison. The visiting room was stark and depressing, but Dorothy seemed at peace in a way she hadn't been before her conviction. "I'm learning to knit," Dorothy said with a slight smile. "One of the other inmates is teaching me. It requires patience and attention to detail, and I have plenty of both now." They talked about the village, about the families struggling in the absence of the 8 conspirators. about the ongoing work of healing community divisions. Dorothy listened with interest, but also with a certain detachment, as if St. Mary Mead was becoming part of her past rather than her present. "I won't return there when I'm released," Dorothy said. "Too many memories, too much pain. I'll need to start fresh somewhere else, where people don't know what I did." "Running away?" Miss Marple asked gently. "No, just recognizing reality. I'll carry what I did with me regardless of where I go, but I don't need to force the village to carry it too. They deserve to heal without my presence as a constant reminder." Miss Marple understood. Sometimes moving forward required leaving places behind, however painful that departure might be. As autumn approached and Christmas grew nearer, Miss Marple reflected on the case that had consumed St. Mary Mead for nearly a year. The poisoned carol, as the newspapers had dubbed it, had revealed uncomfortable truths about human nature, about the fragility of community, about how quickly good people could rationalize terrible actions. 8 people had looked at a problem and chosen murder. They'd convinced themselves they were delivering justice when they were really satisfying their desire for revenge. They'd wrapped themselves in righteousness while planning cold-blooded killing, and they'd transformed a Christmas tradition into an execution, poisoning hospitality itself. The cost of their choice had been enormous. 8 people imprisoned for over a decade. Families shattered, a community divided, trust broken, a tradition darkened, and 1 man dead, murdered during what should have been a celebration of peace and goodwill. Yet Miss Marple also saw signs of hope. Dorothy Mills's genuine remorse and moral courage, Thomas Reed's growing understanding of what they'd done, the community's decision to continue caroling despite the tragedy, the support for innocent family members, the vicar's persistent efforts to maintain community bonds despite deep disagreements. Human beings, she reflected, were capable of terrible things, but they were also capable of growth, learning, and even redemption. The 8 conspirators had made catastrophic choices, but some were beginning to understand the weight of what they'd done. That understanding wouldn't undo the murder, wouldn't restore Marcus Hartwell to life, wouldn't eliminate the suffering they'd caused, but it was something, a small light in considerable darkness. On Christmas Eve, Miss Marple joined the St. Mary Mead Choir for their modified carolling tradition. The new route avoided Gossington Hall, now sitting empty after Mrs. Blackwood's murder years before. The choir sang with perhaps less confidence than in previous years, voices tentative as they navigated the weight of recent history. When they gathered at the church hall afterward, the vicar led them in a moment of silence. "We remember Marcus Hartwell," he said quietly, "a flawed man, as we all are, who died tragically. We remember the 8 members of our community now in prison. We remember the families struggling with their absence, and we commit ourselves to justice through law, to trust in institutions, however imperfect, and to resisting the temptation of vigilante action, no matter how justified it might seem." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Then slowly the choir began to sing again. Silent Night, the carol they'd been singing when Marcus Hartwell collapsed, now reclaimed and restored to its proper meaning. Peace, hope, redemption, not earned, not deserved, but offered anyway. Miss Marple sang along, her voice steady despite her advanced years. The pattern of human behaviour, she reflected, was endlessly complex. People made terrible choices and had to live with consequences. But sometimes, not always, but sometimes, they learned from those choices. They grew. They changed. They found ways to rebuild what they'd destroyed. The poisoned carol would never be forgotten in St. Mary Mead. The scar it left would remain visible for generations. But scars were evidence of healing as well as wounding, proof that damage could be survived even if not entirely overcome. As she walked home through the cold December night, Miss Marple thought about the 8 conspirators in their various prisons, facing their first Christmas. In custody, she hoped they were thinking about what they'd done, genuinely thinking rather than simply justifying. She hoped they were beginning to understand that murder is never justified, that ends don't sanctify means, that justice delivered through vengeance is no justice at all. And she hoped that St. Mary Mead, wounded but not destroyed, would continue its slow healing, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one carol at a time. Rebuilding trust, restoring community, reclaiming traditions that had been darkened but not destroyed. The human capacity for self-deception was remarkable, Miss Marple reflected as she reached her cottage. But so was the human capacity for growth and change. The 8 had deceived themselves into believing murder was justice. But some were beginning to see more clearly now, to understand the terrible truth of what they'd done. That understanding came too late to save Marcus Hartwell or prevent the conspiracy's devastating consequences. But it wasn't entirely worthless. If even one person learned from this tragedy, if even one future wrong was met with patience and legal process rather than vigilante violence, then perhaps some small good could emerge from considerable evil. Miss Marple settled into her chair and picked up her knitting, the familiar rhythm providing comfort as snow began to fall outside her window. The pattern she was working on was complex, requiring constant attention to avoid mistakes. But mistakes once made could sometimes be corrected with patience and skill. Not always. Some mistakes were permanent, like murder, but many could be addressed, learned from, grown beyond. The 8 conspirators had made an irreversible mistake, but they still had time, years of time, to learn from it, to become people who understood what they'd done and why it was wrong, to eventually, perhaps, contribute something positive to balance against the terrible negative of their crime. It wouldn't be redemption exactly. Murder couldn't be redeemed. But it might be growth, understanding, a hard-won wisdom about human nature and the importance of restraint, even when anger demands action. The snow continued falling, covering St. Mary Mead in white, softening the village's edges and making everything look clean and new. It was an illusion, of course. Beneath the snow, the scars remained. But illusions had their place too, offering hope and the possibility of renewal even when reality was more complicated. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily through the evening, forming patterns that emerged only through patient attention to each individual stitch. Much like the work of healing community, she thought. One person at a time, one choice at a time, one day at a time. Slowly, carefully, creating something whole from threads that had been badly tangled. The poisoned carol was over, but its echoes would continue for years, and Miss Marple would be there, watching, knitting, offering quiet wisdom when asked, helping where she could in the long, difficult work of rebuilding what 8 desperate people had destroyed one Christmas Eve when they chose murder over law, revenge over justice, and poison over patience, the end.